Dr. Rob Henderson, welcome to the Listening Bee. I'm so glad that you made it here today, and I'm really excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bea. I'm excited too, and really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and it's amazing that we met at UATX because I got to learn more about you and I got to read your book, Troubled, which is highly recommended. But I just wanted to start off by asking you, can you share a little bit about like your background and luxury beliefs for the people that aren't really like aware of what it is?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote this book, Troubled. It's a memoir covering my unusual trajectory through higher education and some cultural commentary, discussions around class and upward mobility. And so I coined this phrase, luxury beliefs. Currently I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. I got a PhD from the University of Cambridge. I was at Yale for undergrad. But before this, my life was a lot different. Maybe the reason why this book was interesting to people is because my path to where I am now is it was so unlikely. I was born into poverty in Los Angeles, um, and had a series of very difficult experiences. I talk about this through the context of my name. I open the preface of Troubled, explaining that my full name is Robert Kim Henderson, and my first name Robert came from my supposed biological father, who to this day I've never met. Um, and he abandoned my mother and I when I was young, possibly even before I was born. I actually don't know. My middle name Kim comes from my birth mother, who came to the U.S. from Seoul, from South Korea as a young woman, and her life very quickly unraveled. She was addicted to drugs, and we were homeless. We lived in a car. We stayed in this slum apartment for a time. And when I was 3, some neighbors called the police, and they saw the kind of squalor and the circumstances we were living in. And so some social workers came and collected me and placed me into the LA County foster care system. And the social workers asked my mother about, they said, where's this boy's father? Because you're not in a position to care for him. And she was strung out, and she said she didn't even know who my dad was. More recently, I took a 23andMe genetic ancestry test and discovered that my father was Mexican. So I went my whole adult life not knowing that about my background. And so I spent the next just shy of 5 years in 7 different foster homes all around LA. And early chapters of my book, I describe those difficult experiences. Going from different homes, forming relationships with foster siblings, and then being taken to another home, or witnessing my foster siblings being taken and put into another home. And there's just extreme instability in the system. Eventually, I was adopted by this working class family. It was a married couple and their young daughter. She was their biological daughter, who became my adoptive sister. And this was the late 90s. We settled in this kind of dusty blue collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff. And, at the time I didn't know this, but, I got this front row seat to a lot of the kind of ongoing deterioration of poor and working class communities. The town I grew up in was very sort of characteristic of that kind of thing. Most of the adults didn't have college degrees. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of drug use. Meth was starting to become prevalent. The opioid crisis was kind of in full swing. The culture, the country at large, was not yet aware of the damage those drugs could cause. Obviously they did with meth, but not with the prescription drugs. That was not yet part of the cultural consciousness. But I was with this intact family, and I describe how that had a beneficial effect for me. I was improved my grades in school, and I became more focused. But then they split apart, and my adoptive father stopped speaking with me. And there was just a lot of drama and disorder in my upbringing. And I'll fast forward here. If you want, we can get into more specifics, but jumping ahead, by the time I was 17, there was just so much chaos around me. A lot of reversals up until that point. Good things would sometimes happen, but then bad things. And it was really stressful. So I decided to enlist in the military, and left when I was 17. And with some, setbacks and some hiccups along the way, eventually went to Yale on the GI Bill. And that was when I started to think about luxury beliefs. Um, and this idea came to mind, through these interactions with a lot of students and graduates of elite universities who hold strange opinions. I define luxury beliefs as ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent and educated while inflicting costs on working class and marginalized people. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And we can get into specific examples if you like, but one, that I wrote about in my book and in other essays was the defund the police movement. That was very popular for a time, at least among cultural elites. And I've pointed out that if you looked at survey data from 2020 and 2021, and you break down the results by income category, the highest income Americans were always the most in support of defunding the police, and the lowest income Americans were always the least in support. And then when you break it down by political orientation, it was always white progressives who were the most enthusiastic about defunding the police, and Black and Hispanic Democrats were far less in favor of it. And there are many other examples of this as well. There's an idea called the success sequence, which has been developed by some sociologists, which essentially finds that if you follow 3 steps, you are almost certain to not live in poverty by the age of 30. And the 3 steps are graduate from high school, get a full-time job, and get married before you have children. And 97% of people who follow those simple steps are not in poverty by age 30. And what's interesting is that when you ask representative samples of the country, should this be taught in schools, about 70% of parents, Democrats and Republicans, and in fact, I think Democratic parents were slightly more in favor. It was something like 69% of Democratic parents said it should be taught in schools versus 66% of Republican parents. But general, majorities across the political aisle. But this idea is extremely unpopular among highly educated Democrats in particular. So people who have elite degrees and who work white-collar jobs and who themselves actually almost certainly followed those steps in their own life and would encourage their own children to follow those 3 steps. They are against this idea of being widely known and promoted in society, which I would consider another luxury belief. And so this idea, I think, has had a lot of detrimental effects on society as a whole. These fashionable ideas that take on or capture the minds, I think, of so many educated people, and they promote them and they endorse them and they try to get other people to live by them, even when often they themselves don't. And culture matters, cultural messaging, ideas, popular culture, mass media, social media, all of these things have an effect on people's behavior. And, it's just an empirical fact that when elites generally, when they support an idea, it's much more likely to capture the culture. The ideas are more likely to be implemented into policy. But, they themselves often don't live by these ideas. And so, I sometimes borrow this quote from a professor of mine from college who it was John Gaddis, the historian, and he would say that common sense is like oxygen. The higher you go, the thinner it gets. And you see this, I think, with a lot of people who go to expensive universities and, do well in their lives, but then they often will downplay or denigrate the very values that fueled their own rise to success. These people who support luxury beliefs, and they themselves work very hard. They, value education and hard work and success and ambition, but then publicly they will denigrate those ideas around education, occupational attainment, relationships, all that kind of stuff. So that's the idea in a nutshell, and we can get into examples if you like.
Yeah, no, that's it's absolutely fascinating to me how two different people that are on this planet Earth can grow up with such vastly different life and
Mm-hmm.
experiences, and like one person can live with like a mother and a father together in happy relationship, go to an Ivy League and everything, and then never have any experience of like what the majority of people living here have, like with going through foster care and with going through all these experiences that, you know, most people that are in poverty are dealing with. So the different perspectives, like as people grow up and make decisions, they think that whatever they think is right because they've never seen like what this bubble is over here. It's just, it's fascinating. And with luxury beliefs, like how that plays into it, it's like a lot of people don't realize that the decisions they make have such a vast and like grand impact on other people that they don't know the perspectives of. Yeah.
Yeah. It's that's well put. I tell this story in my book. So when I was at the University of Cambridge for my doctoral program, there was a student who we were talking about a little bit about my life and how I had this friend. I write about him in my book. This guy Antonio, who he wasn't a great student, but he was a pretty good football player, and he could have gotten a football scholarship to go off to college. But he was failing one of his classes, and he had to take this makeup course during the spring break, and he, basically just didn't bother going, and so he didn't get the grade he needed to get the scholarship. And I told one of my classmates at Cambridge this, and she replied something like, if that's who he was and that's what he wanted, and those were his priorities, you shouldn't force him to do something like that. If that's not who he was, you shouldn't force him to go to college and go to class and that kind of thing. And I asked her, well, what if that was your son? What would you do? And she replied, well, I would probably threaten to kill him if he didn't go to class. Um, and so, in other words, it's perfectly fine for other kids to, make these mistakes and ruin their own futures and, think in very short-sighted ways. But when it comes to their own kids, a lot of upper and upper middle class people have very high standards and, will, enforce those priorities. But for everyone else, there's this very relaxed, don't bother, don't uphold these standards, that's unfair, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's so fascinating how people make it like if it's personal and it has something to do with them, then they value it a lot more than if it's just someone that they're not related to and don't know. But with
Hmm.
all of the experiences that you've had and everything you've been through, and then you went to like Yale and Cambridge, that's like a huge like difference of people and groups. And you talk a little bit about this in your book too. But I'm like curious, how did you like deal with the like not fitting in aspect of it, because you're so different? Like a lot of people there can't relate, and you can't relate like that. And people like my age, we're dealing a lot with that right now, like with social media and just in general. So what would you say about that?
Yeah. I like that you also noticed that not only could they not relate with my experiences, but I also had difficulty relating to their experiences as well. Um, and so, it was hard. The first semester, the first year, it took me some time to adjust for a lot of reasons. It wasn't just because I grew up in a different sort of background, different family, different socioeconomic bracket, but also I had just gotten out of the military too. So I had just all of this, widely different experiences than so many of these students. But over time, I tried to go in with an open mind. I think that's important. Just go in with an open mind and, find people, understand that you'll have some commonalities regardless of how varied your experiences might be. That, there's always some overlap, it could be intellectual curiosities or habits or ideas. People are generally fascinating to me. But, there were a lot of students who, and I'm not just talking about undergrads, but I would interact with the graduate students and professors and administrators and so on. And, they just lived in this very comfortable bubble, so removed from, not even like, it was interesting, it's so removed from society as a whole, but even within their own the boundaries of the campus. So many people may not be aware that Yale is located in New Haven, and of course Yale is a well-known, rich university. But New Haven, the town that it's located in, is extremely impoverished, very kind of blue collar, run down town, a lot of addiction, a lot of homelessness, a lot of poverty. And so I would go into a Yale classroom and, hear people talking about how we need to, focus on decarceration, or how we need to, abolish the family. And then I'd walk 2 blocks down the street outside of what was sometimes called the Yale bubble. And, I would see people shooting heroin on a park bench, or people who were clearly mentally ill, mentally unwell. And, it was just that clash, that dichotomy of, I would see Yale students claiming they felt unsafe on campus because a professor wrote an email they disagreed with. Um, and they were living in a dorm room surrounded by campus security in one of the wealthiest universities in the world. And then I would walk back to my apartment. I live downtown, and I'd walk back to my apartment and witness people who were sleeping outside and people who were actually unsafe. And there was no concern or regard for those people.
Yeah, it's fascinating how everyone can be in such a bubble. And, the people that are outside of it have such a different perspective. And, like, I recently moved up to the Woodlands, which is definitely a bubble. But I moved up from, like, downtown Houston, that area. And so I can see this sharp, like, contrast between how people and kids were raised here versus there, and what life was like, and the difference. And it's just fascinating to me because it's difficult for everyone my age right now. Like, all teenagers, we have a hard time fitting in because we're trying to change ourselves, and then everyone tries to change themselves and they're not. It's a whole thing.
Mm.
But the people that come from outside the bubble, it's particularly different. Because yeah, go ahead.
When you say change themselves, do you mean like to fit in, or and then how are young people trying to change themselves? Like their look, their attitude, their opinions? What do you
I
mean
think
by
by
that?
saying change themselves, I
Yeah.
mean that we're suppressing our authentic self. Like, if
Okay.
I want to go to school and wear a dress instead of, like, jeans and a t-shirt like most people wear, I'm not doing that because, part of it is herd mentality. Like, we're
Hmm.
wired to survive, so whoever we're surrounded by, we want to become more like them so that they accept us. But yeah, I
Hmm.
mean suppressing, like, our authentic selves from, sharing our actual beliefs. And, like, you mentioned this too in your book, when you were at Yale and, people were having conversations, sometimes it's difficult to speak your complete truth because the rest of the entire class has a complete different view.
Hmm.
You know?
Yeah. That's something that I recommend to people. I just had coffee yesterday with someone who just graduated from high school and is about to start college here in a few weeks. And she asked me about this, about what advice do you have, especially when you're the only one, like if you disagree but
Yeah.
you feel you're the only one. I say, well, you could be smart about it. Don't thoughtlessly just say things and bring negative attention to yourself. Be thoughtful about how you phrase your ideas and words. But then the other thing is, if you have a group of friends on campus, if you can find other like-minded people who, I'm not even necessarily saying like-minded in the sense that they agree with everything you say, but just people who are open-minded, who
Yeah.
are share that commitment to free exchange of ideas. If you can find a group like that on campus, um, then you'll be more emboldened, even when you're away from them, to speak your mind. Because even if you say something in class and everyone hates you, at least like later, okay, well, this will be a funny story when I tell my friends later. Like, you'll have a support group, and they can feel that way with you too, that you all have each other's back, and you can all, sort of reminisce about all this stuff that's going on. And I'll also say, a lot of professors, not all, I mean, there are professors who are very they have very strong ideological commitments, but there are many others, I would say, they're outnumbered by professors who themselves self-censor to some extent, and they like students who are open-minded and willing to challenge the prevailing sentiment on campus, and they'll quickly take notice of that too.
Yeah.
So, just kind of have an infrastructure in place for yourself, build a friend group, make some relationships with students, with friends, but then also with professors as well. And then from that point, you'll be in a better position, I think, to disagree with other students and even other professors.
Right. No, I love that idea of finding people that are open-minded about different and diverse opinions and don't just shut down because they have a different view. And it's interesting that you say that because I was also thinking about like ChatGPT and AI because
Hmm.
I feel like a lot of students right now we're going to AI to not be judged. Like if we're gonna, we won't ask a stupid question in class because we're afraid other people are gonna laugh at us. But we can ask ChatGPT; it doesn't judge us. But I'm
Hmm.
curious what you think AI, how AI is going to have like an impact on relationships and on like our confidence and things like that.
I remember back in the day, the joke was like, you would never want your Google search history to be public. I wonder if the new version of that is you don't want your Chat GPT interactions to be public, the
Yeah.
prompts that you give. Um, it's still very early. There have been a lot of bold predictions about AI. At the moment, we haven't actually. I mean, it doesn't seem like life has dramatically changed all that much. We have this very interesting piece of technology. Um, there have been forecasts about employment and jobs being taken and all this stuff, but I haven't seen anything concrete yet. Um, but I think you're right in the sense that it might change relationships. It's already very easy to never leave your house if you don't want to. You can just scroll social media and hang out in your group chats and on Snapchat, Instagram, and you can have that kind of hollow sense of social interaction online. But yeah, I wonder if with the rise of ChatGPT, now you'll feel even more like they have this other option to have this parasocial, quasi-social relationship with this, non-human entity that you feel understands you or something. So, yeah, I could imagine this fueling, even more so the rising rates of loneliness and friendlessness and people feeling like they don't have much of a social life. Um, but I think like ultimately it'll be similar to uh, kind of what's happened with so many other things like marriage or with fitness or with screen use in general, where you see an increasing divergence among we'll just say like educated, like college educated, upper middle class people, and then poor and working class people, where you see this widening divergence. So marriage rates, for example, used to be the same across the board, regardless of social class. Marriage rates were very similar. Number of children raised by both married birth parents, very similar across the social strata. And now you see that intact families are largely concentrated in the upper and upper middle class, and fragmented families are common lower down the social ladder. Same thing with screen use. So if you look at the rates or how many hours per day kids spend on devices, it's something like 2 to 3 hours per day for children in families that earn $100,000 or more per year, versus kids in families that earn $50,000 or less per year. The number goes up to something like 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day on screens. So, and yeah, there are other, anytime there's a sort of a technology that hijacks your interest, your attention, anytime there's a cultural norm that arises that basically allows you to act on impulse or your hedonistic desires and doesn't require foresight or planning, it seems to impact people lower, even harder. Obesity is another example of this. Once we had sort of widespread abundance of cheap processed foods, we created the first society in history where it's actually the inverse of what you would expect, where the less money you have, the fatter you are, whereas
Yeah.
historically it's always been the reverse. So technology like AI may do the same thing, where educated people with resources, people who are fortunate, can kind of titrate their usage, sort of monitor it, and recognize its potential for its addictive properties, or knowing when to use that versus knowing when to speak with a human being. Whereas people, who don't have much in the way of education and resources, and maybe don't have that many people around them, not much social capital, they'll just increasingly rely on their computers.
Yeah.
So I think it'll fuel increasingly these class divides.
Yeah, it's interesting how AI and like social media and online is becoming like an escape. Do you think that like the reason why people more in poverty spend more time on like screens is to escape from their natural lives?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's true for adults. It is true for kids.
Yeah.
I could imagine for adults it may even go the other way, because if you're working a white collar job, you can spend all day on your computer. But if you're on your feet all day, or you're driving, or you're doing something that requires more sort of manual labor, then you can't use your phone, or you're not on your computer. But for kids, at least, there's probably some of that. It's a form of escapism. It's like a
Yeah.
self-soothing kind of coping response. But alongside that, there are multiple reasons. Another one might be that you just don't have as many adults around.
Yeah.
There's if you have two attentive parents, and one of them is, you're more likely that one of them will spot you and say, "Hey, get off your phone," or "What are you doing?" or enforcing rules around screen use. Whereas if you have one single parent who's maybe working and is distracted and frazzled, they aren't monitoring you as closely. And then even if they are, they may not want to, if their energy reserves are depleted and they're sleep deprived and they have all these things going on, they may not want to enter into a long argument and get into a conflict with their kid about the phone. It's just easier to give the kid the phone and live in peace. And this is another kind of under discussed reason why it's better to have two parents around is, it's just easier to enforce boundaries and rules when you have two adults around versus one. It's uncomfortable to. I think this is a lot of people misunderstand this, that like they think parents want to be like tyrants, like, oh, I want to be like the monarch of this castle, and I love enforcing rules and yelling at people. Most parents don't like doing that. Like, they like when their kids are nice to them, and they like being nice to their kids, and like it feels rewarding to let your kid do what they want. And parents want to see their kids happy, and it's hard to say no and to enforce the boundaries and hold the line. And it's even harder when it's just you and your kid, and you're working long hours and have all these other responsibilities.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've definitely learned that parents want what's best for their children, but often we don't see that at this age. We just think, oh, they're saying that just to get on my nerves, but no, parents want the
Yeah.
best for their kids for sure.
There's a really funny kind of anecdote. Is it fun? It's a little funny. So Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice, he wrote a memoir called "My Grandfather's Son." It came out years ago, and he describes how his father abandoned them when they were young, and his mom was strung out, and so his grandparents ended up raising him and his brother. And his grandfather was a very stern man, and Clarence Thomas talks about how his grandfather would have him and his brother do all these chores and work outside, and they had all like sort of a roster of things that they were responsible for, sort of cleaning and maintaining and all this stuff. They helped out as like ranch hands, and uh, so it was a very strict guy. Then later, Clarence Thomas grows up. He has a son of his own, and he would let his son stay with his grandfather, so the boy's great grandfather. And Clarence Thomas says, one day I came by my grandfather's place to pick up my boy, and I looked on the counter and I saw all these cereal boxes open and all the toys had been taken out of them. And I go into the living room and I see, my granddad and my boy. They're watching cartoons, and it's like 1 o'clock in the morning. And he pulls his grandfather aside and says, "Hey, so when I was a kid, all you did was make me work and hold me responsible for all these things, and it was exhausting. And now here you are with my kid, and you're buying all the cereal boxes and letting him play with all these toys and watching cartoons. Can you explain? And his grandfather says, well, it's simple. Uh, he's not my responsibility.
Mhm.
And it was as simple as that for him. Of, he could just enjoy him, have fun, give him everything he wants and indulge him. But if you're responsible for shaping someone and preparing them for adulthood, you have to, be a little more authoritative than that.
Yeah, and that kind of connects also back to what you said, like when one of your friends at Yale, you asked them a question and then they were like, no, they can do that, but if it was their son, they would do different because of that
Yeah.
responsibility aspect. That's interesting. And I
Yeah.
had a question about marriages because what is your take? Do you think it's better to like be married and stay married together as long as your kid's growing up, even if you're like in a bad relationship and you're fighting all the time? Because I know that love is supposed to like that's one of the most important things to raise a kid and have stability. But if your parents are fighting, does that create like worse than if they divorce and they're both happy separately? What do you think?
Well, I probably could have done a better job in my book of highlighting that both of you, in a relationship, have an obligation, if you have children, to not fight,
Mm,
and to do everything you can to reconcile and be understanding and compassionate toward one another, because the kid can kind of sense, if there's conflict, that kind of thing.
yeah.
So, all else being equal, it's probably better if you have two separated but happy parents versus two, parents who are arguing and fighting and all the time. Um, but the thing, like, that's not even like the majority of divorces now are the result of what are sometimes called low conflict marriages, where there's small disagreements. One person gets bored. They just check out. They just decide, maybe this has run its course. Maybe one of them falls in love with someone else. It's not because they got into fights. It's just, they feel like the relationship has concluded. And
That's
that
interesting.
is what happens now for most divorces. Most marriages are not dissolved due to violence or abuse or aggressive verbal disputes. So, and I think that's worth keeping in mind too. That just because you're bored, or just because you feel like this, maybe this is over, or you've lost the passion or something, that if you're small children involved, it's going to affect them uh, down the road. But yeah, I think there are cases where divorce can make sense. But the thing is, like with divorce, like the divorce rates are rapidly declining. A lot of people don't understand this. The divorce rates are down, and the reason for this is because a lot of people aren't getting married in the first place.
Mm,
So a lot of it used to be that everyone got married, and then the divorce rates were increasingly concentrated among lower people on the lower end of this socioeconomic spectrum, and more educated, more affluent people were more likely to sustain their relationships. But now you're seeing a lot of people, poor working class people, they're having children, but they're not getting married. They just have kids.
yeah.
So the divorce isn't even a question because there was no marriage to begin with. And that is kind of characteristic of what you're seeing in a lot of working class environments. I can tell you this. I can basically tell you what has happened over the generations just using the story of my own adoptive family. Um, so, I mentioned my adoptive mother, and everyone on her side of the family. They were working class people. My grandparents, both of whom have passed, but they were born in the 30s. They got married in the 50s, and they were, they were members of the silent generation. And my grandfather was 21 when he proposed to my grandmother, who was 18. And she actually said no at first. And then she said she would agree to marry him if he agreed to stop smoking, stop drinking, and stop gambling.
Oh,
And he agreed, and they got married. And that in itself is unthinkable,
yeah.
that interaction today. Um, like,
Fortunately.
yeah, no, like that was just, if you heard that story today, you would laugh. It seems so out of date. from another era, and it was another era. So they got married, and they were married for 60 years before my grandfather passed and my grandmother, but they had 4 kids. And these 4 kids, my aunts and uncles, and then so my adoptive mother. It's a little complicated. I just explain it in the book. My mother was adopted herself, but I'm speaking specifically about the biological children of my grandparents. Um, the 4 of them were all baby boomers. They all grew up, they all got married, and they all had kids, and then they all got divorced, which was very common for baby boomers who were working class, especially. The boomers are kind of the generation that pioneered divorce as a way of life. But they still got married. They got married, they had kids, then they got divorced. Those kids are mostly millennials, born in the early and mid 80s. These are my older cousins. And they all grew up and had kids, and none of them got married. So they all had children with people they never entered a marriage with. Some of them have kids with multiple different partners who they don't even speak to anymore. And that's very common for that generation. But now they had kids born in the early 2000s and early mid 2000s, and these are late teens, teenagers, and they're having severe behavioral issues, difficulties in their lives, relationships, friendships, kind of characteristic of young people now. And it's hard to say that these patterns are due to poverty, because my grandparents were actually poorer than any succeeding generation. When they got married in the 50s, my grandfather had dropped out in 8th grade, and he took, odd jobs here and there, and he worked as a mechanic and all this kind of stuff. My grandmother didn't work. So they were really poor, but they were married, and they sustained the relationship and the marriage and raised 4 kids. And each generation is actually less poor than the one before. And yet their lives, in terms of their choices and family formation and behavioral patterns, were arguably worse. And I think in part that's due to cultural messaging. It's due to luxury beliefs. It's due to, if you don't have the right guardrails in place, why, like people say, well, why would you get divorced if you have kids? Well, why not? Like, if you're not happy, why wouldn't you do that? Is that which is the actual question that makes more sense to ask? It's hard to do something on behalf of others. It's easy to do the thing that feels, more rewarding and pleasurable in the moment. So yeah, a lot of this, everyone's responsible for their own actions, especially if they're adults. But ultimately, a lot of the kind of cultural malaise and family fragmentation and public breakdown of responsibility and social order, you can lay that at the feet of, cultural elites, intellectuals, people who are responsible for what ideas become popular and what ideas become implemented into policy.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting and insightful what you just mentioned, especially too about we do what's best for ourselves and we don't always take other people into account when it comes to that. But sometimes I've noticed our brain can trick us into thinking, oh, this is best for them, when it's not. But I'm curious, this is my last question because I know we're getting a little tight on time, but from your military background and going there and having all that discipline, you mentioned how it helped a lot, after being exposed to drugs and all the things that people around you were doing. What's something that you learned when it comes to restraint and personal stopping that instant gratification?
What is something well, I think it's in some ways, having access and resources can actually make things worse. I noticed this first when I was 15. I worked at a restaurant, and I noticed a lot of my coworkers, they were, kind of strapped for cash. They were broke, but then Friday would come around and they get paid. And that is when a lot of them made their, bad choices with how to spend that money, with drugs, with beer, with alcohol, deciding to lease a car they couldn't afford, and then, ruining their financial prospects, and money can help, but if it doesn't come with restraint and responsibility, that can create some problems for you. And so one thing I learned in the military was the importance of self-discipline, of not indulging, of understanding that initially it comes from the top down, where the structure of the military imposes this discipline, but then gradually and you react the way that any young person would react when the rules are extremely suffocating and obnoxious. Is this seems pointless, this is stupid, what is, like, why are they making us do this, or why are they not letting us do that? And then gradually you come to learn that they're doing you a favor. And as you get older, you start to notice that it's not always, if you want to be successful, it's not always about what actions you can take to reach success, but equally important is avoiding taking actions that can lead to catastrophe or failure. So I could give you a list of do these things and you'll be successful, but equally important is the list of things you shouldn't do to destroy your life. Drinking and driving, riding a motorcycle without a helmet, doing hard drugs every night, all these things that and that's what the military does in large part. I mean, they kind of you do your job and you get the training and everything else, but I think equally important in my case was there's a huge list of things you're not allowed to do, and they enforce those rules very rigidly. And so from the ages of whatever it was, 17 to 21 or so, I was I felt like a prison inmate. And then over time I realized, this was helpful for me. And I tell the story in my book of my friend Tyler, who went to prison for several run-ins with law enforcement and drinking and driving. And he was driving his motorcycle drunk and caused an accident and injured someone. But he went to prison, and when he got out, he told me that sometimes he wished he could go back because life was simple and he didn't have so many ways to hurt himself.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing that and immediately connecting that with my experience in the military of, you have this love-hate relationship with the institution. So in Tyler's case, it was prison. Of obviously no one wants to go to prison, and obviously no one wants, the kind of basic training and all the military training stuff where all your freedoms are stripped from you. But on the other hand, it can be extremely helpful if you are prone to acting on impulse and doing things that in the short term might seem fun, but could cause a lot of damage.
Yeah, I love that point that you made, that it's not only setting yourself up for success, but it's also not doing what could derail that success. I think so many people are blind and to that hidden fact. That's so interesting. Thank you. Yeah, so are you ready for our past guests question?
I guess I'm ready. Okay, hit me with it.
I loved this one. It's it's kind of three-part, but you'll be able to answer it. It's nice. So, when was the last time you listened to your intuition? Where did you feel it in your body? And what happened as a result?
Oh my God.
I know.
All right. Last time I listened to my intuition.
Yeah.
So does that mean like recognizing it or acting on it? I guess I'll just go with acting on it. That to me makes more sense.
That's that now. You just listen to your intuition.
Okay, there we go. Can I use that one?
Yeah,
I followed.
if you want to.
And then where did I feel it? I guess kind of in my back, like my spine. And what did I do as a result? I acted on it, I guess. I went with it.
Yeah.
So, all right, we'll go with that one.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm just like, follow-up question. When you were younger, were there times that you like acted on your intuition versus like your impulse? Like when you knew, okay, this isn't right, so I don't do it, or things like that?
Oh, well, okay, that's interesting. You're making this distinction between intuition and impulse.
Yeah.
Because I think of intuition, how would I? Intuition is just knowing something without knowing how you got there. Like you have this feeling, but you don't know why you have that feeling, but it feels right to you. Impulse is what is impulse? I guess impulse is acting recklessly without any thought involved. But No, I guess, yeah, there were times I trusted my intuition. I mean, joining the military was not well thought through. It was not a deliberate strategic move. It was just, this feels right. This feels like the move for me. And it's probably the best decision I ever made.
Hmm.
And, there's many stories in the book of me acting on impulse, and probably not a lot of intuition involved there. So I like that question, though. That was good.
Yeah, interesting, right? Well, thank you. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. I found this conversation extremely fulfilling and insightful to hear, and I'm glad that we got to talk again and reconnect.
Well, thank you, Beatrice. This was
Yeah,
really enjoyable, and I know you have a bright future ahead of you. So
thank
really
you.
appreciate you inviting me on your show.
Yeah, and people can find you on your book, Troubled, on Amazon, and
Mhm.
where else can they find you?
You can find me on Substack, robkhenderson.com, and you can find me on all the social media platforms at Rob K. Henderson.
Awesome. Great. Thank you again.
Thanks, Beatrice.